most of you will probably be at least somewhat aware of this, but I figured, got to go over some very basics here. Watsonville, it started off as a Mexican land grant, Rancho Bolsa de El Pajaro. There were some other land grants that it later overlapped with, but that was really the original one. It was granted by the Mexican government in 1837 to Sebastian Rodriguez and later confirmed to his children. Yes, there was a lot of politics involved with that, with his brother Alejandro. I'm not going to go into all that detail. What's important, though, is that his brother sold the claim, later to be proven illegally, to a guy named Judge John H. Watson and D.S. Gregory in 1852. And that's kind of the start of Watsonville as a place, despite the fact that that sale was deemed illegal in multiple courts. So, not everybody's always got the best origin story. Of course, Watson, and I believe it was his lawyer or a real estate developer, but somebody really, closely associated with Watson decided, let's just call it Watsonville. And so there we go. I believe it was kind of a mistake. It was kind of a playful thing, but here we are today in the stolen, well, partially stolen land of somebody that didn't even really have a right to it, and it's called that, so, woo! Several years later, March 30th, 1868, Watsonville was incorporated as a town. And 68 is actually a pretty important year for a lot of things because that's really when a lot of the balls for railroad development in the area started to get rolling. So, to move on from that though, Pajaro. So right across the river, other little community, much smaller than Watsonville, but what is Pajaro? Well, it's also a Mexican land grant. It was Rancho Bolsa de San Cayetano, and that was granted to the Vallejo family, which is the famous Vallejo family, in 1834. It was one of the relatives of it, but very attached to that. But something that's very important to realize is in the 1860s and early 1870s, Pajaro was farms. There was one commercial building, and the only reason Pajaro existed really as any location at all on a map is because the road to San Juan, or San Juan Bautista, and the road to Salinas and Monterey met there to go to meet a ford for a road that went to Watsonville and Santa Cruz. And so it was a junction, and junctions are always important points for where towns develop. So there was a natural point to Pajaro, but still, one building there, probably a boarding house. I wasn't able to actually find much information on it, but I do have the name, Roberts and Woods. That's what's written on the map from 1868. And that's it. There's just a building there. And so that's kind of where we're at when railroads first start becoming a thing. Something else that, if you've ever seen one of my talks before, I keep banging on about this, but nobody realizes quite how isolated Santa Cruz historically was. It still is pretty isolated in many ways, but historically it was incredibly isolated. By 1870, we'll go with 1871 just to add one extra road. 1871, these are the only roads that you have. You have the Coast Road. This is a road going to Davenport and north along the coast. It could only be crossed at low tide because you literally had to go into the sands north of Waddell. It was not a safe road to go at any other time, and you can't always predict what's going to happen. There's a lot of creeks and channels that you have to go across, seasonal streams. There's a lot of problems to get out that way. Okay, so Saratoga Toll Road, that opened in 1871, so it's actually a little bit into this period already. That one's the one that went up straight to San Lorenzo Valley, eventually was connected with the road to Felton, so you finally get this full route, and that goes over to Saratoga. But that one also prone to slides, prone to washouts, all those kind of things. Mountain Charlie's Toll Road was the most famous and well-known road over the mountains for the Mid-County. If you're in Santa Cruz and you're going over to San Jose, most likely you're going to be taking Mountain Charlie's Toll Road, and that one is called that because there's a toll gate in Scotts Valley and there's a toll gate at the summit. And at the summit, you met up with another toll road, which is the Santa Cruz Turnpike Company's road. And that is the old Santa Cruz Road. If you go up to the summit and you're going north down Los Gatos Creek, you're going to go down that road. And so that toll road was run by a company that was owned by Santa Clara people. And so the San Jose or SoCal Turnpike, which is another route, that one from SoCal, and that's the old San Jose road that's today, that also connected to that same one. So it was kind of two that merged into one to go down Los Gatos Creek to San Jose. Chittenden Pass is an interesting one. You'd think that would be a given for people in Watsonville, except from all the evidence I can find, it did exist in the 1860s, but it seems to have been a poorly maintained private road at this time. So it's not really a viable route. So the only other option then is, if you're in here, you can either go all the way over to Santa Cruz and then take one of these, or SoCal, and take one of these roads, or you go across the Pajaro River and try your luck on that side. And there's other ways. I mean, I assume there was a route that went to San Juan. In fact, I know there was. The route that went to San Juan, because that's why Pajaro existed. But it's not really a good, convenient system. So you've got these really rural roads. It's going to take you a couple of days in most cases to get across them. So ocean travel. Okay, you're stuck here. Let's try going on the ocean. There's that whole bay out there. Let's go out there. Watsonville is absolute garbage for a port. It is completely exposed to elements. They kept trying over and over. So at any given time, there may be a steamship that's trying to send some boats out to pick up people. There's 50-50 chance that pier's already washed out. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So there is one protected port here, which most of you guys know about, which is it was Hudson's Landing. It was called Millard's Landing. It was called, I have a note for it somewhere, but it was another landing before then, but it's at the top of Elkhorn Slough. Again, you get the same problem. It has to be at high tide for a boat to actually make it there. It probably required frequent dredging. It's just, again, not a great source. So when you're in Watsonville, you're kind of a long ways from a lot, and historically. Santa Cruz, you're trapped, but at least you have a seaport. Santa Cruz Seaport was actually the second most profitable seaport in the state in the 1860s and 70s, so it's doing pretty good. It's not the greatest port, but it's got a lot of stuff going out. But Watsonville, you're kind of stuck here. So yeah, transportation was slow. Also, you have to remember, what are you actually hauling out? You're trying to haul out wagons. Wagons are heavy. You got wagons full of lumber and split stuff, which is just like pickets for fences and things like that. These are heavy, and you got to get these to someplace. You got to take them up the mountains. You got to go over these toll roads. You have to get to Santa Cruz on the wharf. You're not making much money. You can see why there was such a farming population here. There's just not that many people here, and it's not profitable enough. There's cheaper places people in San Francisco can get their goods than having to get them from here. So it was really a big problem. And then I also add here that there's spoilage. You can only do certain types of agricultural crops because they're going to spoil if you wait too long. We'll come back to some of these subjects a little bit later because they are important. But the real thing to remember is this is an isolated area. It's hard to get products out and still make a profit from them. And this is really a motivating factor because a railroad would just fix these problems so completely. Just to give you a better idea of the whole regional situation. I mean regional as in the West Coast. California, other states in the West Coast. So we have the Sacramento Valley Railroad. It was incorporated August 4th, 1852, and construction began in 1855. That's the one you'll usually find in your textbook as the first railroad because it eventually linked up with the whole Central Pacific system, and small parts of it still exist in some way or another. Central Pacific Railroad, though, is probably the more important one to remember because June 21st, 1861, it was incorporated. It's a pretty early incorporation date, and it's right around the time that Civil War is happening. So you got this big project started right when all of the government's resources are directed at a completely different issue. Also during the Civil War, the Pacific Railway Act. Now, anybody who's done anything with transcontinental railroads, Pacific Railway Act was the act that officially allowed for the first transcontinental railroad to be built with government subsidies. Subsidies is a word you're going to get sick of hearing because this is a whole talk about subsidies. So 1862, Transcontinental Railroad is approved. But again, still don't have any money because the government's still fighting the Civil War. Confederates are taking all those resources away. So construction optimistically started in 1863. But this is actually, for our regional purposes, the absolute most important thing. The idea of a transcontinental railroad really got people in San Francisco excited. And so, San Francisco, peninsula, so what's the nearest place that you're going to go? If you're in San Francisco and you don't want to go over water, you got to go south. And what's the nearest city to the south? San Jose. San Jose, it's an old settlement from the Spanish days. It's done pretty good. It has a bit of a port with Alviso and Dumbarton area. It's kind of rough, but it's good enough as a place for the railroad to go as its first stop. So what ended up happening was a group of financiers incorporated San Francisco and San Jose Railroad, and it was built quite fast. And eventually this would effectively serve as the terminus. This route would effectively act as a terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad in respect to getting to San Francisco by land. They officially considered Oakland, but you still needed to take a ferry. So if you wanted to not take the ferry, you still had to go all the way under the bay and up. And that's where we're at in 1865. Southern Pacific Railroad then. What's that? What's this new thing that's just popped up out of nowhere? Okay, so we finished one Transcontinental Railroad. How about two? Who wants the second one? This one, the Civil War is just about wrapping up right now. We're gonna go south. Because what's a thing that can help unify the South after this horribly destructive war? Let's build a railroad that goes to the bottom part of the country. So we got one through the middle, one through the south. There would later be one up north. And so those are the main transcontinental railroads. There's kind of more now, but those are still today essentially the three transcontinental railroads. So the group that actually incorporated this was the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad. Because San Francisco was still the premier city of California. If you're in California, you're going to be going from here. So you go south from San Jose, and then eventually you're going to decide you now need to go east because you got to get south enough that you're not going to be Central Pacific, you got to be south. So you're going to go down to LA and then cut over. And so the route was very unclear. And that's where Watsonville really benefited, is nobody quite knew, okay, how are you going to get to Los Angeles? You can go Central Valley, you can go the Salinas Valley, you can maybe go San Benito Valley, like, see which ways it go. Most of the people thought eventually it would go into Central Valley, but how do you get to Central Valley and where do you cut over? And just as a footnote, the actual Transcontinental Railroad was finished on May 10th, 1869. That got you to Oakland. The next big step for people in Santa Cruz is like, okay, there's a railroad that's not that far away. Let's do something about this. Moving over to Santa Cruz County. Here's a couple milestones for people in Watsonville. Some of these you'll know, some of them you won't. Charles Ford, whose department store was quite famous, started off as a big general store, I think just like a block from here. I'm not very good with the geography here, but yeah, it's really close by. Yeah, so that was 1852, and he soon hired a guy named Lucius Sanborn as an employee, and they quickly became co-owners, and that ran for several decades until Sanborn eventually retired, sold his interest back. I already mentioned Brennan's Landing. That's the name, Brennan's Landing. That eventually became Hudson's Landing. That was still an important port, and that did provide Watsonville with an outlet. And then this is something that it will take a little bit of a pitch on my part, but this company, Brown, Williamson and Company, incorporated December 1863. Well, actually, it was incorporated earlier. Ford and Sanborn, though, became the lead investors in it. In December 1863. It's not known that well by that name because it later became the Watsonville Mill and Lumber Company. And then later still, it essentially became the Loma Prieta Lumber Company. And that firm, with those partners, led to harvesting almost all of Corralitos Creek, Eureka Canyon, and then they moved over to Aptos Forest and just started getting everything out of there. And so it's a huge endeavor. And in 1863, we've already talked about how hard it is to get lumber out, yet they were still commercially getting lumber out of Corralitos Creek in the 1860s and making a profit. That's pretty impressive. But you'd think they'd have a great desire to get a railroad because that means they'd be able to get their products out. And some of the frustrations that the rest of us talk will center on that fact. And I should mention also that one of the books I edited, The Reign of the Lumber Barons, tells that story as a key part of it. As the next book, or as the next point on here also overlaps with the tragedy of Martina Castro and The Reign of the Lumber Barons, Frederick A. Haynes claims to Rancho Selcal augmentation. Now, this augmentation, it was a huge property right in the center of the county. It actually went into Santa Clara County a little bit. It's a massive property that's almost entirely forest land. It's pretty much everything from just above the town, really the town of Aptos actually, north to the county line, up to the summit. Most of the summit houses and properties were part of the augmentation. It's this huge property, and Frederick Keene managed to get his hands on a ridiculous amount of it. He also ended up getting a bunch of Rancho Socal, which is how he got Capitola. All of old Capitola was his property. And so with this augmentation, he's got a whole bunch of lumber, or timber, that he wants to turn into lumber, and he needs to get this happening. This is the earliest photo I could find from about 1910, showing some of the works. Even in 1910, Hudson's Landing had some machinery, or some port work going on. You could still take steamships up there. They'd probably be pretty flat-bottom steamships. So they likely would have transferred to larger ships off the coast. Here's our friends Lucius Sanborn and Charles Ford. And here is Heen, and this is the closest I could get to the right time. He has a lot of photos later in life and only a couple from earlier in life, but that's him with his daughter, Catherine, and his wife, Therese. All right, so let's get into some railroads. So the first project that we had was the California Coast Railroad. It was incorporated all the way back in June 17th, 1867. And I have a speculation I'll show you here. This map is based on what they said and what the newspapers said. The problem is I don't have the surveys for most of these. A lot of the surveys have just been lost if they really ever existed in a final form at all. But what I suspect is this mostly followed Riverside Drive through Chittenden Gap and stuck to the north side, where if you drive it today, there's actually quite a deep cut in the road there. So that would have been something that the railroad would have dealt with. But the benefit of this route is it would have popped you out into Watsonville from the northeast. It never would have had to cross the river at all. And it would mean that Watsonville would have its direct connection. And I show it connecting at Gilroy because even in 1867, speculators suspected that the Southern Pacific Railroad's first stop would be Gilroy. And so they'd never actually put into their paperwork anything suggesting they'd go beyond that. This is already a long enough route. I believe it's 20 miles. Yeah, it's almost exactly 20 miles. And you may recognize some of the names on here. We have Chittenden Gap, but also he was a large landowner and influential person in the city at the time. We have Ford, we have Frederick Keene, who's really, I believe, the only person from Santa Cruz on this, and then two other landowners. These are just the directors. There's quite a few people. I think there's 40 people that were involved with this. And so this railroad, it was optimistic, but it's unclear how realistic it was, because the communities at the time didn't really have the money, and this would have been a really expensive endeavor, especially for this time in history. And it should be noted, the concept of a narrow gauge railroad, which would have been cheaper, did not exist in California in 1867. I don't think any of you are quite old timers enough to have really remembered railroad school, but you may have heard of it. You may have seen it when doing your own research. But railroad school is this curious little school that used to sit out kind of near Chittenden Gap on the main road. And it was established in January 1868. Now, why is there a school named Railroad School where there's no railroad? And it's because of the California Coast Railroad. The survey, this is much we do know, the survey would have passed right through by the site of where this railroad would have gone. And so they were very optimistic in 1868. This railroad is going to happen. We're going to name a school after it right on its route. And while the school was established, it became a full school district. Its first sort of house was in 1869. Its first permanent house was 78. It stuck around all the way until 1946, or until 48. It eventually got amalgamated into South Puedes, Union Elementary School District, and was then decommissioned just 2 years later. Its population got quite low. But that's in its third form, which is the one that was built by William Henry Weeks. So it even had a nice, the local architect that built so many things, he built that as well. But yeah, so you can see, there's this little trace of these early railroad days way back in 1868 when somebody optimistically named this. And this stuck around for decades, 80 years. the memory of this railroad. And as one funny aside that I have to point out, it did actually include a Little Bay Railroad in the district. It didn't include it next to the school, but Chittenden is the only place in the county that the original Southern Pacific Railroad passed into the county. It briefly passed in from Santa Clara and then crosses over at Logan into San Benito County. But there's a little section, and that was actually part of the railroad school district. So technically speaking, it didn't lie, it just got the alignment completely wrong. All right, so that's the first failed railroad. So let's go with the successful railroad. The Santa Clara and Pajaro Valley Railroad, incorporated January 2nd, 1868. This one was a much longer route because it was the route that everybody was hoping for, the route that the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad, as a subsidiary, would run from San Jose to Gilroy. So it's one that they already suspected was going to happen, so that's why they didn't even bother going past Gilroy. It's this interesting little railroad because it pretty much ceased to exist almost as soon as it was done, because it just got folded into the parent railroad. As you can see, it only took a year to build, and that's still the railroad that is the route today on the Main Coast Division. If you go south from San Jose to Gilroy, you're going to be on that alignment, more or less. I mean, it may have been shifted a teeny bit, but it's still more or less following that same alignment. All right, the California Southern Railroad. Now, this ended up being a very controversial railroad because it was the next step on the line. After we get to Gilroy, where are we going next? So this one actually ended up messing with people quite a lot, especially investors interested in building a railroad to Watsonville or Pajaro. So it was incorporated January 22nd, 1870, and it was supposed to be essentially the Southern Pacific Railroad. But the strange thing is, they were doing surveys and stuff, but there's no hint that there was actually any financing behind this or actually any grading work being done. The other railroad kind of was just like, we're building it, and they started. It's like, why aren't they doing this one? So, it's like, what's going on? Why is this happening? So I did mention the California Coast Railroad, the one that Heen and Ford and Chittenden had supported, just disappears from newspapers at this point. So it seems that it said this is a good replacement and we don't have to build it. So they're happy. But then this weird thing happened on October 12th, 1870. All of a sudden the railroad just ceased to exist and it got consolidated into the Southern Pacific Railroad. It's like, what was that railroad doing for all those months? 10 months. It's floating around and nothing's happening except surveyors are out there and speculators are speculating. Okay? Well, it seems that it was kind of a bit of a con, that they're maybe trying to seem like they weren't the Southern Pacific Railroad, and then they finally just decided in October, the jig's up. We're just the Southern Pacific Railroad, guys. Sorry, don't know why we're trying to scam you. They're probably trying to get lower prices for property. That's the assumption. And so the Southern Pacific Railroad finally said, we're building it, guys. We're building the route to Pajaro. Everybody's like, wait, what are you doing? You're building the route to Pajaro? What's Pajaro? Watsonville's the town. There's nothing over there. It's just farms in an intersection. Like, what's going on? So Southern Pacific said, if you give us $100,000, we can make a route to Watsonville. And the people are thinking, we're a tiny little community. We don't have $100,000 just sitting around. The whole point is we need the railroad to be able to make money. And so they gather about $8,000, and the railroad's just like, how about $50,000 and we'll put it across the river from you? And I was like, wait, what? Aren't you already getting us, aren't you already coming this way? We're not giving you $8,000 or $50,000 to go across the river. So they didn't. They didn't give them the money because, again, $50,000 is a lot of money in 1871. And Southern Pacific said, okay, we're just going to build it anyway. We don't need the $50,000. We just wanted some money from you. So July 17th, 1871, construction began from a small location about 2 miles south of Gilroy. That's known today as Carnadero, the butcher place. It was an old site in Mexican times. And then the tracks reached Pajaro not that much longer. November 27th, 1871. It was 20 miles of track, and they got there in about 4 months. So it's pretty good. So they're finally here. People in Watsonville kind of, sort of, are a mile away from a railroad. Yay! All right. And just to show you the route. So this is the route they took, and it's the route that we have today. So not really much of a surprise. There's Carnadero, still marked on Google Maps as a place because Google Maps has a longer memory of locations than actual people do. So, yeah, if you're ever wondering about where places used to be, Corporal, Sergeant, Google Maps, they know where they are. I just have one picture. This one's taken many years later in 1900, but this is kind of showing you a bit of the desolation around Chittenden at the time. It's just farmland. This is the railroad tracks crossing the main road, which I believe today they don't do. They now cut over. But at this time, the main road was the one that was on the other side of Chittenden when you're going through there. I think yeah. You can see a little parallel service road, and that used to be the main road. So it used to cross the tracks. Thank goodness it doesn't anymore because trains still run on that, and they're sometimes quite fast. The real question here is why on earth did they go to Pajaro and not just cross the river? Okay, well, so there's some reasons that seem very beneficial to people in Watsonville, but to railroad, you can kind of go like, oh, I kind of get that. There was nothing in Pajaro, which means they could buy the land relatively cheaply, and they could just sprawl out. They could sprawl in any direction except for the river, and they could do whatever they want there. If they came to Watsonville, there'd be people that live there, and there's a downtown. They've got things, barriers in the way. They can't just build wherever they want. So cheaper, available land that they have the potential to further expand, and they did. I mean, anybody who's been across the river knows that yard is quite large, and it used to be larger. Also, there's just the functional nature of it. Where the bridge crosses the Pajaro River through Chittenden Gap means that they got bypass all of the deep cut that would have been required to follow the main road. So they could cross the river once. It was a bigger trestle than they would have needed here, but cross it once, and then they wouldn't have to deal with that anymore. And as most of us know, later on, it became very beneficial because the quarry ended up being built right across the river where that bridge goes out, the Logan Granite Rock Quarry. They didn't know necessarily about the quarry there. That was a little bit later, but the hillsides do slope there in a beneficial way where it didn't require nearly as much cutting. So you have an open yard, you have a lot less work. The only substantial cut was a place called Sand Cut. It still exists west of Aromas. If you're in Aromas, you can look west from there and you can see a big leg of a hill and there's just a big V cut into it. And that is the Sand Cut. It was originally a tunnel, then it was not a tunnel, then it was a tunnel again, and then they finally decided to make it even wider so it would stop caving in on itself. And then the last and most important thing is they were going to cross the river at some point because they really wanted to go to Salinas. Salinas is really where the main population area was for the Monterey Bay. So they're going to have to cross the river. So I figured might as well cross the river where it's the cheapest and most convenient to them. And sorry, Watsonville, you're just going to have to cross the river. I mean, the fact of the matter is there wasn't really a good bridge across the river at the time, so a lot of people forded it, which of course didn't work in the winter, but that's Watsonville's problem and Santa Cruz County's problem. It's not theirs. The railroad doesn't care. So in the newspapers, you can see right after the route was finalized, people in Watsonville especially, and the Pajaronian were really ticked off because they realized that they'd have to figure out how to get across this river. And since it was a river that crossed into another county, that added a whole nother factor because they could technically only build half that bridge. And from what I've read, they may have only built half that bridge because there seems to have been a lot of evidence that Monterey was kind of dragging its feet. Monterey was a much bigger county, but also relatively sparsely populated, so didn't have a lot of money to throw at a bridge across a river they aren't really going to use much of. But then this is another factor that I think gets overlooked. Southern Pacific in 1871 did plan to build a Santa Cruz railroad. They just hadn't gotten to it yet. These are the earliest photos we could find at the Pajaro Valley Historical Association. So we have a couple ones of the Stoser building, who was also an investor on the railroad. Miss California at the 4th of July parade in 1878. We have a picture of downtown from 1879. So you can see it's a pretty hopping downtown for a pretty small population. This is later, but it's the same depot. This is the original depot that was at Watsonville Junction, which is called today, but the town of Pajaro. Back then it was called Pajaro, the station was. So you can see a nice busy day there, about 1900. And just a year later, you can see this is President McKinley's train at Pajaro Station. In 1870s, I've already explained, a lot of crops couldn't really transport because before trains. So what were the top commercial products at the time that the railroad arrived? What were the top commercial products that they were shipping out? Apples and pears, lumber and split stuff, wheat and corn, sugar beets, and beer. What do all of these have in common? All of these could transport to San Francisco by train, which was still a slow process, without spoiling. Because at this time, it's probably taking about 6 hours to get to San Francisco by train. It would speed up over time as the engineering and the tracks got more efficient, but you're taking about 6 hours in 1871. Apples are one of the few fruits that grow quickly and have enough volume that you can have a certain percentage of spoilage and still make a profit. Plus, if you toss a little wax on them or other preservatives, they can last quite a bit longer. Lumber and split stuff doesn't really go bad. Wheat and corn doesn't really go bad if don't get affected with weevils or anything. And also, if it does start going bad, you can hopefully save it by turning it into beer. But also, there was a lot of beer processing here. And sugar beets was a brand new thing. They were experimenting with it in 1871. They went full in with it in 1874 when the SoCal sugar works started. And then they paused when that shut down, but then they came back in the 1880s when Spreckles finally moved to town and started doing all that. But so sugar beets, these are pretty much going to be the main industries here until refrigeration. So that's something like lettuce, artichokes, strawberries, most fruits, citrus, anything else that you've grown here historically started with refrigeration because you need that longer term storage. Or it turns into canned goods because you do the packing in person here. This is also something I don't think people realize. Watsonville in the 1870s, in fact Santa Cruz County as a whole, but really Watsonville in the 1870s did not grow very much. From 70 to 80, there's only about 1,000 people, in fact it's only about 950 people added. Watsonville had about 600 people added. It was not a heavy time for growth. The economy was kind of slumped in the 70s also. The whole county grew about half by half in that time, but a lot of that was with the North County. And North County was literally everything from SoCal north. We're looking at population here in Watsonville that's less than 2,000. And then the whole Santa Cruz County side, including Aptos and Freedom and Corralitos and whatnot, we're looking at 4,000 people. It's just not a huge population. And we're trying to get money for these projects. So how do you get money? When the government's poor, when the local government's poor, subsidy. I said it's coming back. So a new law had passed in 1870, which Frederick Keenan helped pass when he was an assembly person, to allow public subsidies. We have these today. We call them measures and propositions, the ones that cause money, or that cause tax-based income for government projects. But they weren't popular. People didn't really like subsidies at this time. And this one barely passed, and then the new governor hated them. So they're uphill battle right from the start. But there was this solidarity in the county that we need a railroad. The problem was Watsonville residents felt they already had one. You don't want to pay for something that you're not seeing a huge benefit from, especially when they're asking for a lot of money. How it worked is you derive 5% of the county value. So I gave the county value, it's $2.1 million in 1871. In the end, it's about $100,000 is how much they could determine they could get from that. So election was held December 11th, 1871 to approve a gift for a standard gauge railroad across the county, about 20 miles from Santa Cruz to Watsonville. Here's the breakdown of the vote. And you'll see most of the counties supported it. But when you look at Watsonville was almost unanimous in its opposition to it, as San Lorenzo was at this time, because they weren't going to be included with it, so they didn't want to pay it. Watsonville in this election included Corralitos. So it passed, but it did not pass. Watsonville did not pass it at all. Almost everyone else did. But the thing that was unique about this specific election is they were really hoping to just build this $100,000 so they could bribe the Southern Pacific Railroad to finally build the Santa Cruz Railroad. And the planned Santa Cruz Railroad was something that the Southern Pacific had already surveyed. Stanford had already come here to look at the route. And so it was thought this would be easy. So give them $100,000. It's going to cost about $500,000 to build it, so we'll just convince them to come over. They incorporated a railroad, as you do. And this is our third paper railroad, I suppose, one that didn't succeed. January 18th, 1872, 20 miles. It's going to stop, importantly, at SoCal, Aptos, and Corralitos. This route was going to follow the Southern Pacific Railroad's surveyed route. It would have been inland, probably followed Freedom. Here, this is based, again, off newspapers and the actual articles of incorporation, which are not super specific. But what I predicted is they were going to break off there, go up about 2 blocks from Main Street, and then kind of go up all the way. It probably wouldn't go to Corralitos directly, but cross over on Freedom and pretty much follow Freedom and SoCal all the way to Santa Cruz. That's what I'm guessing. It makes the most sense. It's kind of the easiest grade, and that is the Old County Road. And usually the older roads are the ones that have the least difficulty in making them. So that was the plan. And note, this would hit all the major spots. It would have hit Corralitos, Watsonville, Corralitos, Aptos, SoCal, and Santa Cruz. Those are the places where people were living in 1872. Note the director, though, Frederick Keene. He's back. He backed the first railroad, and now he's backing this one. But this time he's the president. He's not just one of the investors, he's the investor. He's the guy. Most of these people are friends of his. Almost all these people are Santa Cruz people, so we're not getting a lot of Watsonville people here. And I mentioned the narrow gauge. So 1870, a completely different project that seemed to have nothing to do with Santa Cruz popped up. E.N. Robinson began advocating for the transcontinental narrow gauge railroad. Why? Because it would be cheaper, it would be easier to build, you could navigate the mountains easier, the tunnels would be smaller. The only downside is pretty much incompatibility with other routes, and I suppose smaller freight loads because the cars have to be smaller. But sounds like a great idea. Of course, he can't really fight Southern Pacific, so he's going to do it down the coast. Any coast railroad project that they've ever proposed, and there are about 20 of them, so this is the only one we're really focusing on here, would have gone through Santa Cruz County to Watsonville. It was from Watsonville that they decide, are they going to go inland or are they going to go south? So this is the first of many railroads that's going to have this, but this is the only one that actually had an impact on Santa Cruz at the time because it introduced the concept of narrow gauge railroad and interconnectivity with other narrow gauge railroads. And that's something really important. We're not just focusing now on the Southern Pacific Railroad. We're focusing on a full network of narrow gauge railroads that are going to span the country. All narrow gauge railroads in California can essentially link their origins to this railroad project. Okay, so Southern Pacific decided we don't want to do this railroad. Your $100,000 bribe's not going to work. All right, let's do this again, guys. Going back to the polls, doing another 5%. Income's increased a little bit from the last year, so now we can pull $120,000. But through a loophole, they're able to double that because now they're going to say we're going to go across the whole county. So now it's not a 20-mile route, it's a 40-mile route. 20 miles from Watsonville to Santa Cruz, 20 miles north to Point Año Nuevo, where it will eventually connect with the road that will go across San Mateo County. Interconnectivity. To the south, we're also going to connect to the Monterey narrow gauge railroad that's just kind of starting to get some of the speed that will eventually result in the Monterey and Salinas Valley Railroad. So now we're the middle part of a 3-part network that will connect San Francisco to Monterey. Super exciting. So of course it goes to vote. Oh, and technically it could be standard gauge, but that's just so they can make sure that the bribe to Southern Pacific still is there in case they want to take it. Here's the vote, and oh, what do you know? Pajaro, which is Watsonville, voted $395. Okay. But if you notice this, everyone else is in favor now, except for, well, yeah, actually everyone else is in favor of this. SoCal's still in favor. San Lorenzo's now in favor because now the railroads potentially get help them. Scotts Valley is now a precinct, it's in favor. New Year's, which is Point Año Nuevo and pretty much the whole North Coast. They weren't even in the poll last time, but they're in favor. Corralitos is in favor, and SoCal. And that is because at this point in time, they're still telling everyone it's the same planned route as the last election. They didn't reveal or show all their hand. So, again, we incorporate. I know, this one's at least not a paper railroad. So the narrow gauge Santa Cruz Railroad, the one that actually gets built, June 16th, 1873, Klaus Spreckles has popped up here because he's got more money than Heen, and Heen reluctantly admits it. He also has more clout in San Francisco, So he says, fine, you can be the president. They switch back and forth a few times, but he's the first president, and the two of them have essentially parity with the number of stocks. Whenever one of them goes up, the other one always buys the same amount, and they keep doing this throughout for the first 4 years of the railroad. And unlike before, the Board of Supervisors actually contracted with this company. So this is now officially the county's railroad. It is supported by the county. They've got half of the grant initially of $120,000 to work with, but they have to build 5 miles first. And this is where the things start getting really scammy. They do a new survey, and this new survey reveals something really interesting. They're not going inland this time. They're going to go through the lands of many of its investors. Well, that means Keene owns Capitola. So we're going to go to Capitola instead of Soquel, which is not owned by Keene. He owns a lot of the rancho, but not that part. And we're going to loop up to Aptos, which is also owned by actually, Aptos is owned by Spreckles, but Keene owns all the land north of it. So, okay, well, now we're looping there. And we're going to go back to the coast because Titus Hale, another one of the investors, owns a whole ton of Rancho San Andreas. So we're doing this wavy thing, following the coast a lot of the way, though. Which is interesting. And the most interesting thing is they haven't quite decided what they're going to do with this little section here.
Oh, gosh.
This will be a point I'll bring back in a minute, but that little point here, because Watsonville's here, their goal is here. How do they get from there to there? All right. So they start construction, which it made sense because the ships are here and also there's access to wood, timber from the mountains. So they start in Santa Cruz, essentially at Seabright, and they start going mostly towards Aptos from Seabright, but they also slowly but surely cross the San Lorenzo River and work their way into Santa Cruz. Okay, just a fun picture. This is their construction engine, the Betsy Jane. Put some people on it. Here's an advertisement. No mention of Watsonville on the advertisement, just to note. Even in 1880, that animosity had not faded, so they're focusing on Capitola, Aptos, lands of the two investors, and Santa Cruz, the destination. All right, so things start getting really messy now. So January 9th, 1874, this 5% law got repealed. Now, mind you, they've already passed the law and signed contracts. That becomes a point of contention. So can a law that's already been put into place and led to contracts just be withdrawn now? Watsonville's leaders began to argue that there's no longer required to pay the subsidy. Yay! Okay, we don't have to pay the subsidy. And of course, the lawyers are saying, well, of course you still have to pay. It's a law. But also, they're kind of getting mad because, well, this route may not go through Watsonville. So now they're really not paying for anything and not getting anything out of this. So why do they have to contribute to $120,000? And then Hean does what Hean seems to do a lot. I do think that Hean is often the villain of stories. Some people think he was maligned or that he's a nice guy and he just sometimes comes off bad. I think he was intentionally scamming stuff here. So he pretty much says, hey, if you give us a little bit of money, Watsonville, we'll redirect into Watsonville. We'll redo this survey. He had no intention to do this. He just was lying. He was trying to get them off his back for a little while so he could keep working. And so in a completely different case, Coleman versus the supervisors of Marin County in October 1874, the judge ruled that a beneficiary has to be named in the law when the law is voted by the public. The Santa Cruz Railroad was not named in the law that was passed in the vote that was done in 1872, which means technically they had did the exact same thing that Marin County did. All right, what does this mean? Well, it meant what you'd expect it to mean. As soon as the railroad finished its first 5 miles, they said, hey, Board of Supervisors, can I get that first grant? It's $30,000. And they said, yes, we'd love to. And then Charles Ford smacked that hand and said, no, injunction, and got the local judge, David Belden, to agree to an injunction until they could figure out what's going on. The official causes for this injunction is that the route currently under construction deviated from that put to voters, which is true. That should say 1872. Sorry for the 74. Stuck in 74 land while I was writing this. Issuance of bonds to a beneficiary not named on the polling material violated the law per that recent ruling. And that the issuance of the subsidy will cause irreparable harm to the people of Watsonville. Oh no, those poor 5 people that actually had good amounts of money in 1874. Irreparable. But the judge agreed. So Santa Cruz Railroad is not getting their money, at least not now, until this goes to the courts. So I am going to actually finish this part of the story just because it overlaps a lot with the second part. Klaus Spreckels and Frederick Keene personally financed the railroad for almost 2 full years. They had to. It involved Keene pretty much doing the thing he absolutely hated doing, which is groveling at Spreckels' feet saying, can you give us a low-interest loan for the amount of the subsidy? Because we really need this money, and we can't build the railroad without it. And Spreckels did, and he did his usual humble thing of sticking it in his face, so he secretly bought up stocks behind him to once again catch up because Spreckels had pulled ahead with the stock game. So he used some influence and got some stocks back. Fortunately for the railroad, the injunction was overturned. On February 20th, 1876, the injunction was overturned and finally the county could pay. And they did. They paid right away. They were on top of it. They gave the $30,000 right away, and a few days later they did an inspection of the next 14 miles and gave them pretty much the rest of it. So the only issue here is really the last mile and a half. And so they got a whole bunch of money finally, but a couple years late, and the interest had already built up. We'll rewind a little bit. So subsidy matter is dealt with. But now we have that weird gap in the middle of Watsonville. Does the railroad go to Watsonville or not? This has been a war by this point that has been going on for years. I call it the battle in the slough because it really was. Do you follow the slough up to Watsonville, or do you cross the slough and just go across the river elsewhere? So management did begin negotiating again in 1875, but again, it seems to be in bad faith because they were trying to get them to pay them for this route. Again, like last chance, guys, it's now or never. We're going to build across the river 2 miles south of town unless you give us some extra money. This is the proposed route. So the route was going to go pretty much just where the junction with Highway 1 and 129 are. It's just going to go about there. It'll just go straight into Pajaro, Watsonville Junction, and completely bypass it. And what they argued is that this crossing of the river was a cheaper bridge to build. And it also required a little less track. It's like, okay. I mean, they have a that's technically correct, but then they made their own mistakes. So Keene and Spreckels asked for $20,000 for that. Of course, the city couldn't really pay it. And then they did the thing that you should never do. Reveal your hands before you're ready. They started just carving up the farms along that right-of-way. So there's about 6 farms along that right-of-way to the river, and they just started plowing through them. They started grading their railroad right through it. They cut fences, broke irrigation ditches, let animals go free, pulled up orchards, ruined crops, all without compensation, warning, or anything else. They ripped fences down. Like, they just made a mess. And as you'd expect, that kind of would annoy people. So all the people did a class action lawsuit, or the equivalent of, at the time, a joint lawsuit against the railroad saying, whoa, 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 you can't just steal our land. And what the railroad argued is, well, Judge Belden said we could. And the problem is, Judge Belden was citing a law that had been overturned in January of that year for another railroad in Santa Cruz County, because the San Lorenzo Railroad, which never succeeded, had done the same exact thing with Henry Cowell's land, and the Supreme Court of California said you can't steal land without compensation. It ended up being a foundational law when the new Constitution in California was built, saying you have to always compensate with correct value for the land if you do it. So just a few months later, Judge Belden's like, no, you can plow right through that land, no problem, it's fine. And so they sued, citing this problem. And then it just gets more crazy. I mean, the whole situation just goes, as my old advisor would say, pear-shaped, which seems appropriate for a place that also grew pears. November 22nd, 1875, Alvin Sanborn and other landowners, they sued. They sued the judge, because the judge is the one that made the actual bad ruling. But the railroad also was ticked off now, because now they can't build, because essentially there's this whole back and forth. So the railroad decides they're going to sue all 6 of the landowners. So suit, countersuit, everybody's just throwing lawyers at each other. And then just on top of this, a massive storm in October 1875 knocks their pile driver and its donkey engine, a big steam engine, into the river, and it washes downstream. So they're working on building, they've already graded and vandalized all this property to get to the river, and they're starting to build the thing over the river. They've already got a couple piles in there, and a storm just washes the whole thing away. So now they can't even work on construction anymore, and they've got an injunction from this new case, and they're now downstream literally fishing out their expensive equipment from the river, trying to figure out what on earth to do. In the winter, generally speaking, they didn't do much construction in winter. So finally, they realized the problem here is heen. Heen is just not trustworthy anymore. Spreckles, people like. They don't like heen. So they say, Heen, sit in the corner. Spreckles and Benjamin Porter, who has a lot of connections here. I believe he lived here with other Porter relatives across the river here. He had connections all over the county. They're reliable people. So they sit down with the town trustees and say, guys, we have too many lawsuits. Nothing's happening, and we're like 2 miles from our goal. What do we need to do? And so the solution they decided initially was, we'll build a branch line to Watsonville. Well, that's ridiculous. It's 2 miles. So the town trustees said, yeah, it is ridiculous. Why don't you just reroute the line through Watsonville? It's like, all right, what are you going to give us for that? And they said, we'll give you free right-of-way along the slough, along Watsonville and Harkin Slough, and we will give you free rights to run the track down Walker Street or Rodriguez Street. And you can build a bridge over the river, and then it can connect. And they said, okay. They clearly settled on Walker Street. And they finally said, fine, this is it. And then at the almost exact same time, Sanborn and his colleagues won their lawsuit against Judge Belden. And Belden was reprimanded by the Supreme Court, saying, like, you can't do the thing that we just ruled against. So, yes, they had to get compensation, which worked anyway, because at this point the railroad was not going to compensate them. So they gave them some money back for the damaged property, but they weren't going to buy that property at this point. And so this is the route that we've got. And this is the route that we still have today, more or less. And it goes here. I call this the Nuga turn right here, because there's a train station that was there called Nuga, or originally Laguna or Millers, because it was on the Miller property. And so it's a compromise, though, because this map's not great with the slough, but you can see the little blue line of the slough. So followed the slough right up into town, bypassing Main Street. That was always the thing Watsonville didn't want. They didn't want the tracks on their main road. And so they wanted to be a block or two away from it. Oh, check that box. It went around, and it finally reached the yard. So yeah, I've already said some of this, but construction resumed immediately, like seriously, immediately. They recovered all the machinery that was lost in the river, and the track was actually complete on May 2nd, where the new locomotive Pacific, I'm setting the record straight here, it was not the Neptune. There was never a railroad owned by the railroad company called Neptune, despite what other people see. There is a single source from May that says that was called Pacific, and the second railroad was the Jupiter, bought a couple months later. Those are the only two, other than the Betsy Jane, which is the construction engine, that ran on the line. And so the first through train was on May 7th, 1876. And from that point on, Santa Cruz had rail access, and it would, with some interruptions, but for the most part, have it continuously from there. Passenger service didn't actually start until the week of May 20th. Earliest record I have is the 18th is probably the first day, but what's notable is there doesn't seem to have been any celebration. There was kind of a fake celebration the year earlier for the railroad, saying, hey, we're kind of open to Aptos, woo! And I think that kind of stole the thunder from it, and by the time they finished this, they were just so exhausted and probably broke that they just didn't have the energy anymore. So while individual people did, and Heen, according to one oral history I just read today, Heen may have given out candy to children on the May 18th run, which may have been the first commercial passenger run. That seems to have been the bulk of the celebration. And yeah, I've got a couple photos here. That is the Jupiter, not the first one. That is the second train. That's actually at the Smithsonian. If you ever are in Washington, D.C., you can see that restored there. This is a couple years later, but I'm pretty certain this is narrow gauge. It's really hard to tell. It's certainly a very early photo if it is a standard gauge, but this is going across Woods Lagoon, which is now the yacht harbor in Santa Cruz. It's another beautiful one with a woman sitting in the front and a big billowing blanket sheet that's covered in ash over the tender there. A flat car there. I'm not actually sure what's hauling. I just want to include these two quotes to kind of end this talk. At last, this is from the Sentinel, and you'll see a contrast here. Sentinel has been wanting this for years. At last, our enterprising young city is in full connection with the rest of mankind. At last, she is free from the rule of the sleepy stagecoach. At last, she is counted among the shining jewels that the deft fingers of commerce have woven together with threads of iron. At last, the same conduit of life and wealth that vivifies her sister cities brings daily treasures to the veins of Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz was very happy when their railroad was finally completed. This is before passenger service started even. In contrast, the Pajaronian, the advent of the narrow gauge railroad in Watsonville tends to add very materially to the lively appearance of the town and will also tend to make some change for the better in general prosperity. The directors of the road seem to be doing all in their power to put the road in excellent condition. We see no reason why a flattering business showing cannot in due time be shown. Much more bureaucratic. They're kind of just admitting it's like, fine, it's done. I guess we can stop fighting about this because it's done. I mean, they're still going to be paying the subsidy for years, but that's done. But the contrast there really underlines this entire drama that happened over several years. Is Watsonville had this railroad, and they really didn't care that Santa Cruz didn't. Santa Cruz did have a good port, so we'll give them that. And they actually built the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad, which went up to Felton during this time. So they had an outlet for their lumber, but they really just didn't have this. They didn't have that connection, that direct connection with the railroad. So Santa Cruz, you can see why the people in Santa Cruz really wanted this thing. But at the same time, you can see how the people in Watsonville, they've got a standard gauge railroad just across the street. And over time, they did benefit from the railroad passing through them. I mean, go down Walker Street, look at any historic photos of all the packing houses, the canneries, the cold storage, or what are they called? The freezer, you know what I mean. The freezer plants. All of those wouldn't have happened there had it not been for that railroad eventually getting built. But they didn't see the benefit of it back then because without refrigeration, without the canning industry, without all these other things, it's just, they could ship their stuff across the river. Yeah, it was a little bit more inconvenient, but who cares? But Santa Cruz didn't have that. So that's really the thesis of this is there was a time when Watsonville had this monopoly, and better or for worse, they didn't really care that Santa Cruz didn't have it. Here's the original Watsonville station before the current one, which hopefully it stays standing for a little bit longer. This one used to be across the street from where that one was. And you can actually see, there's the new one, and there's the old one to the left. The left one eventually got demolished. And that's it. Thank you, everyone.